Thanks again for coming. As Liz said, my name is Sarah, and just a little bit of background. I actually am a retired professional ballerina. So the arts to me are very dear and have been with me since I was, this big, and have continued to influence my work and certainly where I ended up heading later on in life. For the last 12 years, I've been a community development practitioner, really looking at things from this lens that we are all using right now, which is how does art and culture build communities and revive our local economies. And then about 3.5 years ago was introduced to this organization that's based in Cincinnati that's been around for 8 years called Design Impact, and where we use design thinking and a lot of other creative and innovation lenses and tools to actually drive change in the social sector. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that, but that's sort of my trajectory in terms of creativity has been woven throughout, just as many of you has experienced. So who we are. So Design Impact, like I said, we're a social innovation nonprofit, and what that really means is that we partner with other nonprofits, sometimes nonprofits working in the workforce space or education or health, sometimes philanthropists, to design both creative and inclusive approaches to really complicated social problems. And so the creativity that we bring to the table is that half of our team are industrial designers or graphic designers, and so we bring this design process, these innovation methodologies and ways of thinking, but we are also very inclusive in the way that we work. So the other half of our staff has a social justice or community development background, so we bring those practices to the table to challenge our partners to say, if we are designing anything, we must design with those who are experiencing the problem at the table, at every step of the way. They must define the problem with us, they must generate solutions with us, and they must build those solutions. And so that's just a little bit about who we are and how we work, and as I mentioned, we've been around for about 8 years. I share this image just to say that, like, inherently, we'll learn more about the design thinking process today if you're not familiar with it. Our work in general is very user-centered. So I give this example of Starbucks or maybe a local coffee shop in your town where you walk in and sometimes people know your name, they call you by name when you order your drink, it's warm, it smells pleasant, it's friendly, it's designed to get you in and out of there in a seamless way, but this is a little off. But this is the DMV line, let's be real, and if your DMV experience is different, I'm moving to your town. So in the sort of world of social, in the social sector world, we oftentimes don't lean on that user-centered experience as a way to drive our program design. So again, just another reason that we exist. So our goals for today, my goal today for you is to introduce design thinking and give you an example of how it plays out in community context. And then I also am going to provide you with some of the mindsets and tools that we use. It's just going to be like a scratch on the surface of part of this process that hopefully you might take along with you that will help you deepen your engagement in communities. So that's what you're in for, whether you like it or not. A very general agenda, I'm going to do a design thinking overview. We're going to talk about problem framing because in the grand spectrum of the design thinking process, there's the very first part is how we frame our problem. And I speak from this, from a place of being a community development practitioner, we are better at inviting people to brainstorm with us, or we're better at asking people for feedback. But when it comes to actually defining and framing the problem, I know in my experience, that's sometimes a place where we lack, and it's the very first step that we take. And so we're going to spend time in sort of that problem framing, what happens in the beginning. And there's a couple of tools I'm going to share with you around that. This tool called How Might We, which is a really simple way to think about your problem. And we're going to talk about empathy and empathic interviewing, which is one method we use to understand what's happening in communities around particular problems. And then if we have time, I'll try to wrap up with a little bit of silent reflection, because that's good to do. So is anybody familiar with design thinking? Couple people, a little bit, couple people. So it's a jargon term, but really what it is it's a problem-solving process. That's all it is. It has a particular methodology, but the reason that we like it is that it employs creativity, which is critical for us, we feel, in the social sector. And it employs empathy, so that user-centered, that really connecting with humans and understanding the many layers and many pieces behind people and their decisions and how they live their lives. But it also relies on our rationality, which is good, because we've got proposals to respond to and policies to make and work within, so we have to be rational. So that's what it is. It's a problem-solving process. And lots of different organizations that, we are, obviously we feel as though we are unique, but there are many other great organizations like ours around the country that are using a similar process, and everybody talks about it in a different way. And this was our attempt to really just try to talk in layman terms, which is to say that the process of design thinking always starts at first with this building of relationship and this building of empathy. And the way that we build empathy, one way that you're going to get practice today is one-on-one empathic interviews. We observe people in communities. We also pull down quantitative data and evidence-based data to get the whole picture. So we take a 360-degree view of a problem. Again, being human-centered at the focus. In the middle of all of this is our community, whoever that community may be, whether it's like high school math students or pregnant moms, whoever that community is that we're exploring, they're always at the center. And once we collect all of this data, after we've built this empathy, we start to make sense of what we heard and what we learn. And so what emerges are themes or things that we keep hearing over and over again, or things that we saw or things that we read that all seem to belong together. And then what we do is we try to say, well, which of those themes is there really an opportunity for innovation? Where is there a chance for change? And then let's grab onto that theme, because as you know, these problems are super complicated and wicked, and there's many facets to them, and so they feel inactionable. And so for us, it's about pulling out the themes and grabbing onto one that we say, we're going to tackle this. And then we spark ideas together. So that's when we brainstorm with community, with the head of community organizations and funders and politicians. We put everybody in a room together and mash them up and say, let's design solutions together. It's a really important part of the process, we feel. And from there, we take one of those ideas or two of those ideas or five of those ideas, and we say, let's prototype them, let's try them out in a really quick and fast way, in a way that costs us $50 and 20 hours of time, not in a way that is a $20,000 grant application. So before we do that, the first step for us is prototyping, which is, if somebody were to design a chair, a designer were to design a chair, they'd mock it up without the real materials to make sure it functions okay. So that's what we do, and that's basically the design thinking process. Sound good? And it's in your workbook too. So we're going to spend time today in this building empathy piece. I'm going to give you real quickly a case study, and it's a creative placemaking case study in our own community in Cincinnati, where we had a local LISC chapter and our local United Way and a CDC come together. And like so many of our communities are facing, I must have had this conversation 15 times since I've been here in less than 24 hours. It's a community that is currently racially and economically diverse, but the development pressure is huge. And as this particular community development corporation said, we want to use creative placemaking as a way to build community. They were concerned that the same people were coming to the community council meetings, the same voices were being heard, and there was a whole group of, part of the population that was not at the table. And so they said, let's use this design thinking process to get to those people so we can design a creative placemaking strategy that taps into that. And so we started out by asking this question, how might we involve residents that are disconnected in the development of Walnut Hills? And what we did was we went out and we built empathy. So we interviewed a ton of people in their living rooms around the community. We ended up doing a couple of sort of ad hoc. We did a focus group with young people because youth was something that just kept coming up over and over again. We also adapted because we learned through our process that women in this community were really willing to sit down one-on-one with us, but men weren't. And so we hosted a dinner at a restaurant and they came, and we had some really great conversations. And I share with you just 3 of the many, many insights that we heard, that we pulled out from what we learned, that we lumped together. So that eventually led to an idea I'll share with you. So the things that we learned as we made sense of all this is that residents want to get involved beyond meetings, or they hate meetings. Like I hate meetings, especially if they're like 6 o'clock when I'm hungry and then there's homework and all those things, right? Residents wanted to connect with each other. They weren't not showing up to those meetings because they didn't want to connect. They wanted to connect with their neighbors. They recognized that everything was in transition and they had this desire to connect. But also residents like to make things. We talked to them about the things they did that were creative, that they had dance parties in their kitchen and made food for their families and decorated their homes, and so that they liked to make things. And so we thought, if we put these 3 things together and we brainstormed around them, what might we come up with? And so what ended up happening was this resident idea called High Fives, which is a signage program whereby residents would grab a sign from somewhere, basically tag their neighbor or their fellow business person and highlight something that they love about them, and then plant it in their yard or in the front of the storefront or somewhere else in the community for everybody to see. So it was a visual representation of all of the assets of the community, including those that were oftentimes buried. So those sort of people that weren't necessarily always at the table were getting their praises sung. So that's what that was the idea that ended up happening. And then what we did too, because we knew people hated meetings, we said, okay, well, we don't want to build this by ourselves. We think the community should build this since it's their idea. And so we set up on a beautiful October day in the middle of this pocket park and just had tables, and for 2 hours people could come and they helped us make decisions, and they made decisions about, well, where do people pick up the signs and what time and how long should we have the signs out there and what does the sign look like? And they really designed this prototype, and what emerged from it too were a couple of leaders who said, you know, we want to take this forward, and they set up the Facebook page and told their neighbors and organized the final event so that on a cold day in December, everybody came to the rec center, grabbed 20 signs, made their signs, you know, used art to make their signs and then placed them in the neighborhood. And then over the course of 2 weeks, 30 other people came and grabbed signs from the community center and placed them around the neighborhood. So this was a prototype. Besides the cost of the signs, the cost was relatively low. And they took a pause over the winter, and they're developing their next evolution of this. So that's sort of an example of how a problem went from, you know, understanding what was actually happening to an idea to a prototype. In short, any questions? There's a full case study of this on our website. So I'm going to move into problem framing and get you guys thinking about some of your own work a little bit. So as I mentioned, I'll just start with this quote because I think it summarizes things really well, which is that if Albert Einstein said, if I had an hour to solve a problem, I'd spend 55 minutes thinking about it and 5 minutes thinking about solutions. So this is, for us, oftentimes we don't have that luxury, right? There's an RFP due or a city council meeting, and so we have to get a solution quick, and we have to put it out there. And then we go back and we ask for feedback. We really challenge the partners that we work with to spend a lot of time in this problem framing space, because if you get the problem wrong, then in the end your solution may not have the impact that you thought it would be. And I'll give an example and a perspective in a minute. But when we talk about framing, we really just talk about a perspective or a point of view and being able to take on someone else's view. So when you're building empathy, when you're seeing the problem from many different perspectives, you might start to see it differently, and perhaps the problem even changes shape and morphs. The clear example I have of this is our Head Start in Northern Kentucky was trying to increase enrollment into this community, which you can't tell from this picture, but it's actually elevated on a hill, and it's pretty geographically isolated in terms of transportation. And so they came to us and they said, all right, we've got our problem. It's how might we increase transportation so that we can bump up Head Start enrollment? And we said, I mean, you guys have seen this. You know transportation is a barrier with some families, but are you really sure? We want you to go out and build empathy with those families and make sure that that's truly the reason that they're not sending their children to Head Start. And then we said, you know, you probably can't go there with clipboards or send a survey. You should find a way to go and be with community. And so this teacher said, I have an idea. I got a bubble machine. We'll put it in my van. We'll get those little wedding bubbles and we'll pass them out to kids as they bring their parents out to talk to us. So they did it. They drove up there with a van. Hopefully it wasn't white and creepy, and blew bubbles, and kids came out and they said, hey, we'll give you this little pack of bubbles if you go get grandma or mom or dad. And so their parents came out, and they had just a conversation, a relational conversation with these parents, and they learned that transportation was not the issue at all. It was the fact that parents assumed when they heard the word preschool that their 2-year-old was going to be sitting in a desk, you know, forced to raise his hand, and they just didn't see it. They thought of their child as being in this play space. And so they totally changed their problem framing, right? So they said, instead of how might we provide transportation, it became how might we shift parents' attitudes around preschool. And so if you can imagine solving those two different things, you would get to a different place. They were literally ready to write a $75,000 grant for a shuttle. And so for them, this meant what they ended up deciding to do was well, we'll take Head Start to the hill. That's what they called the community. And so they replicated a classroom and brought it into a green space up in the neighborhood and had parents and kids interact with the teachers, and they tripled enrollment. And all they did was take their program out to the community, whereas they could have spent $80,000, $70,000 on a shuttle that wouldn't have really yielded the same results. So that's why we talk so much in the design world about the problem framing and getting it right in the first place. So if you haven't noticed yet, there's this thing called not the how height we, but the how might we. Ooh, I just realized that, and the whole morning session had this. So there is something we call the how might we. And it's really just a way to frame a problem. So if I'm saying like police relationships, the police relationship with our community is broken, it's a problem. If I flip it into a how might we statement, I would ask how might we, and I couldn't insert anything here, I'm saying use art to strengthen the community's relationship with police. And so just in that simple act, I am transitioning from a problem statement to something that opens up opportunity. And we always start every project with an initial how might we, and it changes 7 times because we learn like we did in that last example. But eventually we get to the right one that we can solve for. So what I want you guys to do is actually take a stab at writing a how might we for something that you're working on now. It could be your creative placemaking project, could be another challenge you have back at your organization. But if you turn to page 5 in your workbooks, you've got some lines there, and what I want you to do is just quietly, for about 2 or 3 minutes, think about how you would reframe a problem you're facing or a challenge you're facing into a how might we statement. Okay, so that's how might we. Yay, you just learned your first design thinking tool. So I mentioned that today was sort of a combination of tools and mindsets, and so one of the mindsets that we really try to embrace is this idea of a beginner's mind, which is really just this, we all have expertise, that's why we're here, we have experience, and that's wonderful, that leads us that helps us do our work better. But oftentimes when we are tackling a problem, we're so close to it, we think we know everything about it. And so adopting a beginner's mind is to say, I might not know everything about this problem. So you're approaching it with a different level of curiosity. Which is a practice, I think, that, it just takes a lot of practice. But it's this idea of approaching something, shedding some of your assumptions, which may be very true, like that transportation assumption could have been valid. But just knowing and being able to go in with it to say, I want to explore, I'm going to listen and see if there's something else I can learn before I jump to conclusions. So that's the beginner's mindset, and we talk about that from the very beginning. And I'm going to switch gears a little bit to talk about empathy, which is, approaching these conversations with community with the beginner's mind just leaves you open to being having an empathic relationship with that individual because you're taking away any assumptions you have about them from the very beginning. This is just one, there's many ways to define empathy, but we talk about it as in terms of something that comes into your head and stirs your heart and causes you to act. So many of us got into this line of work, right, because we learned something and then it really touched us, and so we just felt compelled to get into this field, get our hands dirty, do something about it. And so this is how we define empathy. But I think that this woman named Brené Brown does a much better job talking about it. Has anybody seen this? A couple people? So it's wonderful. I've watched it maybe 25 times. So I'm just going to let her talk about it and enjoy.
So what is empathy, and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed. And then we look and we say, hey, you climb down. I know what it's like down here, and you're not alone. Sympathy is, ooh, it's bad, No. You want a sandwich? Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with "at least." Yeah. And we do it all the time. Because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So, I had a miscarriage. Oh, at least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, "I don't even know what to say right now. I'm just so glad you told me." Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.
So what does this actually mean in terms of design? So I think that, and why does this framework of empathy even exist in design thinking? It comes from this place of like, if I have empathy for someone, or if I understand their problem in a different way, if I can really take on their perspective, then the solutions and the way I might approach the problem will be different. And I'll share this with a pretty clear example. This is Patricia Moore, who is a pretty famous industrial designer, and she's a woman, which is not common in the field. And she exercised an extreme sort of effort and empathy, whereby she was curious about, wanted to know what it felt like to be older in a community with some physical challenges. And so she made her hands difficult to move around. She scratched her glasses, she bandaged her legs, and she basically went in and out of community dressed like this for 2 years. So it was quite an extensive amount of time. She was trying to build empathy for what it felt like to have these challenges. And she even played around with like, what is it, how do people respond to me if I dress up as someone who's poor versus someone who's not? And then she noted people's response. And of all of the many, I can't imagine what she learned. Of all of the many things that she learned, she picked one thing that she decided to focus on. And she created what we now know as OXO. Because she was in the kitchen trying to make dinner night after night, and those stupid utensils, like the carrot peelers that cut into your hand, really made her mad. And so she developed a whole line of kitchen products. So that was all out of this sense of empathy. So she took on another person's perspective, and something emerged for her that was different. So empathy can also create action, and so the example that we like to share is the ALS Ice Bucket Challenge, which emerged from this place of, hey, what if we get a bunch of people to like feel what it feels like to experience ALS, which is similar to having a bucket of cold ice dumped on you and your muscles locking up. And so they, as you know, maybe some of you in here participated. It launched this huge social media campaign, and it really connected with people. And so they had the hope to raise $10 million, and they raised $155 million. And I'm sure there was other aspects of the campaign too that like drove this, but for them, they felt like the empathy piece was something that was really powerful. So that's why we talk about empathy so much in design. So we're going to get to a tool and give you a chance to practice empathic interviewing, which I'm going to just go over what it is. So maybe some of you do this now, and maybe I'm just putting context behind it, but it really just focuses on the relationship with the interviewee. So rather than going into a conversation with a list of 10 or 15 questions or a survey, it's just really about building a connection with that person. And you allow the conversation to flow, because where that conversation goes, where that person takes the conversation, is in learning in and of itself. So if I'm talking to high school students about why they're not doing well in math, and that student keeps talking about their grandmother, maybe there's a relationship there. Maybe I find out that grandmother also hates math, and that person has a huge influence. I'm making this all up, but has a huge influence on this child's life. So it's about listening to those conversations and navigating that. And you're doing this because you want to uncover the motivations and the meanings behind someone's action that they can't necessarily fill out in a checkbox. or answer. They might even give you one answer, but the purpose of empathic interviewing is to dig a little bit deeper. And you're paying attention to things like body language and how people are actually, what's their face saying when they're using those particular words. So this is just some information that we had. There's a local company in Cincinnati that does a lot of consumer product-based research. They do a lot of ethnography work and empathic interviewing, and so they gave us the statistic, which is that most of the emotional information that we communicate or that we get from people comes from body language and tone of voice and a little bit from spoken word, but most of the time we generate ideas from spoken word, from spoken word, right? So we collected data, or we know, or somebody told us something, and so that's where we generate ideas for. So this is just to say to pay attention to those things. So I'm going to give you a couple of tips, and then you're going to embark on an empathic interview with a neighbor here. Just some tips in terms of if you're going to go back and do this in your community. The first one is just to find the right person. So again, it's why it's good to start with that how might we. So what do I want to learn? And then who needs to answer that for me, or who can help me answer that question? And the second is to make what we call an interview guide, which is really, anywhere between 3 to 6 questions that you will guide your conversation, that you want to make sure you maybe discuss, but it's not a prescriptive list of questions that you need to make sure you hit. And it feels so much better because you go in and you're like, okay, I know I just need to talk to this person about these 3 things versus I need to make sure I get all these questions answered. So during the interview, we always suggest you do them one-on-one. So in that Walnut Hills case study in Cincinnati, like I said, we met people in their homes or wherever they were comfortable, if it was like at the park or at the rec center, but it was just us and one other person and sometimes a note taker. And so what's interesting too is you all can find your flow, but sometimes I find it awkward if I'm taking notes while I'm talking to them. So I might even refrain from note taking unless they say something and I'm like, I want to get that. And I let them know. But the other trick sort of ask open-ended questions, so stay clear of yes or no's. Use that sort of, again, that beginner's mind, that why. Well, I want to know more, tell me more. And vary your collection. And finally, after the interview, since I'm not taking notes, the one thing that we do is like unpack information immediately. So don't go back to my office, but actually find somewhere to sit down and just dump everything that I heard so that I make sure that I capture that. So those are just some general tips for doing this. And you're going to get a chance to practice it a little bit with each other. So what we're going to do is you're going to conduct a 5-minute interview with a partner. You can pick the person next to you or someone else in the room. And there is a list of, we made up an interview guide for you. Keep saying we like there's somebody next to me. They're here in spirit. In general, we just sort of have a conversation with somebody about why they're in the line of work that they are in and what motivates them and what inspires them. So there's a list of questions if you want to look at it first before you find a partner. What you're going to do is find somebody and you're going to take turns. Each of you are going to have 5 minutes to interview one another. If you feel comfortable taking notes, you can. If you don't want to, you don't have to. And then we'll wrap that up. So I'll let you know when it's time to switch. But first, just find somebody and get started on interviewing. You guys looked really great. You looked like you were empathically interviewing. I saw a lot of listening and nodding. So here's what I want you to do, what I want you to think about for just a minute, silently, is if you had to get your partner, now that you've empathically interviewed them, a $30 gift, what would you give them? Just think about that for a second, maybe jot it down. But what gift would you give your partner now that you've had a conversation with them? If you only had $30, if I was just passing out $30 right now to everybody. So we work in 2 ways. Sometimes we partner with an organization where we are part of their team, and then in that case, usually there's more capacity on our end to do these longer interviews. A lot of times what we're doing is what we're doing here, where we might be training people with tools, but over the course of multiple weeks and days, and they go out and they do 30-minute interviews because that's the capacity of their organization. But they're different than the conversations that they've had in the past with somebody, because they're one-on-one, because they're letting the conversation be guided. So it can range. It depends on how much you want to learn from somebody and how much if it's very focused and you're like, I want to talk to them about a specific thing. I think maybe this wasn't even clear as far as when you have a problem and we talk about looking at it from 360 degrees, there's your primary person who's affected by that problem that you need to interview, but there's also a bunch of people around that problem that you want to talk to. So maybe it's your board, maybe it's a local business owner, maybe it's the transit authority, whoever it is. maybe it's the economic development group, but you're trying to understand their perspective of the problem and then bring them together. And the neat thing is when you maybe see the themes and overlap, like the thing we heard from the transit director and the thing we heard from the community, like those things make sense together, and there's some aligned passion there and some aligned opportunity across these various groups of people. So, awesome. So there's just a couple of, we're kind of wrapping up, but I wanted to share with you a couple of other things. So we say go beyond questions. So if you have a particular group, that you want to interview or talk to, it's good to have an interview guide, but we also try to get creative with the way we seek information out of people, because questions are good, but sometimes having creativity is good too. So this is an example of something in my neighborhood where we were just trying to learn more about what people felt about their community. So we actually had them pair up with a neighbor at a community council meeting and share a story. And then I had to take that person's story that I heard and draw a picture or write something about that person's story and attach it to this pinwheel and put it in the ground. And so even though it was an actual kind of mini art craft project, whatever it may be, we learned something from it. We could pull insights from the stories that people told, and then in turn the things that resonated with their neighbors about their fellow neighbor. So that's just one example. I mean, I'm sure many of you in your own creative placemaking work are even learning as you're doing it and finding ways to uncover things about your community. This one was another creative placemaking project in Cincinnati where this organization had gone out and done a bunch of empathic interviews, and they learned a lot about people's general desire to look at this park in the community that had been neglected. So they wanted to learn more, and they wanted to try something different around the way that they gathered that information. So they created coloring book pages that had like a map of the park, but then also all these little squares you could cut out and color and paste what things you wanted to go where. You could draw your own things on the park, and they engaged young people a lot, and then they displayed them. They had a couple of storefronts, so they displayed them on the storefront. So then even as community could start to see like, whoa, where am I? I see like everybody really wants some sort of temporary theater space at Bramble Park. So it's just another creative way to get information out of community, but be visual about it. And it was coupled with empathic interviewing. The next tool is actually in your workbook. It's called artifact interviewing. And so there's specific steps if you feel like you really want to try this. But it's about really, you could do this two ways. You could bring a bunch of random objects to an interview and then ask someone to answer a question by selecting an object and explaining it through the lens of that object. So in this instance, we had said we'd ask these organizations to pick something off the table and then describe their organization from that object. So he picked a globe and he talked about his organization as it related to this thing. So you just might get something different than if you just said, tell me about your organization, or tell me about what your experience is like with this particular service. If I had to pick up this shiny diamond thing, I might come up with something different. So it's another tool to use as part of your conversations. And then the last one is that I'll share with you is something called journey mapping. Which is another way. So sometimes we're trying to understand people's daily lives or their routines, and if we just ask them, we might not get everything, and so we ask them to be visual with us. So we'll give them, an 11 by 17 and have them actually map out their day, or maybe we want to know about their week or a particular couple of hours. In this case, we were curious about this mom's schedule and her child's schedule, and then we layered that with sort of, well, tell us where the pain points are in your schedule. If she doesn't, you can probe with questions around this thing that she or he or anyone is creating. Sort of allows you to sort of go a little bit deeper. Or you could have people overlay emotions. So draw smiley faces or anxious faces or sad faces. Like tell us your emotions through visuals in front of us. And so what can we learn from that versus if I just asked you? Especially if you're talking to people about personal things that might be hard to just sort of expect them to sit down and open up their entire life to you. So those are just some other things that are in here that we're not going to get to practice today, but are there for you to use. I also, I printed extra workbooks, so if anybody wants to take a couple back, please let me know, because they're very specific to this, so I've got a bunch up here. So the last thing we're going to do in the last few minutes is just before I think Liz will officially dismiss us with a few reminders, is just to take some time to reflect. And so there's a reflection worksheet on page 13, and just take a few moments to think about, maybe what are 3 things that stood out to you in this material? What are 2 questions that the material has provoked? And what's one thing you might take back with you and start using next week? So it's just no one's collecting this. It's just a place of reflection before we jump into the next plenary and things.